Hi, I'm Anderson Brown. I wanted to talk to you about the classical Chinese philosopher Mencius today. I've been really enjoying finding out about Mencius, and let's go to the share the screen here. Get rid of that. Okay, got this up. I'm always so slick with all this stuff, as you know. Mencius, and I call it there, you see, modern wine in an ancient bottle, because I was really struck by sort of how progressive and modern some of Mencius's ideas were. Of course, the Chinese tradition is always very full of surprises that way. Uh, Obviously, it's something sometimes if we're coming out of a very sort of European-based exposure to philosophical thinking, sometimes we're surprised to find things in ancient philosophy and in Asian philosophy that aren't what we expected. I say modern wine in an ancient bottle because I think that Mencius has really kind of exploded some distinctions that we have, notably about sort of rationalism in philosophy in a really, I think, impressive sort of way. So without further ado, then I just want to go over this sort of basic idea about Mencius. First of all, a little bit about the life of Mencius. This first millennium BCE history is always very important in teaching ancient philosophy of any kind. Mencius, as you see, they're living in the 4th and then to the beginning of the 3rd century of the Common Era, the century of a little slightly younger than Aristotle there. He lived about 200 years after Confucius, you see on that bullet point there, and after Confucius, usually Mencius tends to be the first person mentioned as a sort of representative classical Chinese philosopher. On the second bullet point, he was like Confucius, who was basically an orphan, both Confucius and Mencius from high status families, but fatherless, and so at some social disadvantage. In line with the Confucian emphasis on environment as a shaper of character, there's the story about Mencius that first he and his mother, his widowed mother, were living next to a cemetery, and she noticed that he was imitating the mourners. She didn't like that, so she moved to a house near a market, and then she heard him sort of hawking things like the merchants, which she didn't like at all. And so then she moved near to a school, whether that was by chance or not, it doesn't say. And he learned to be a scholar. Of course, the point of the story really is the kind of very sort of Confucian point that environment really emphasizes character. And there are a lot of stories about Mencius's mother giving him moral instruction. Also, the whole idea, of course, that his widowed mother is giving him moral instruction is part of, again, this sort of romanticization of his life. Like Confucius, he became an educated person, educated enough and respected enough that he spent his adult life as an advisor to various rulers and potentates of one sort or another. He did become disillusioned. At one point, he thought that someone was going to institute all of his ideas, and he found out that he was basically being used. And so that was finally the last straw. As a fairly older man, and he withdrew from politics. And in all of this, it's very similar to the story of Confucius. But last bullet point there, he did develop a set of ideas. Confucius very well known as a kind of very formal, very sort of rational. Confucius is the sage, who's going to give us sort of an axiom that guides us and explains sort of eternal truths and that sort of thing. Mencius, a more earthy kind of character with a more earthy kind of message, but one that adds and expands and improves Confucius. And Mencius, as I'll point out in the presentation here, is very much in the Confucian line. He's certainly not a break from Confucius. There were, of course, as there are in all of these big traditions, whether you're talking about the Chinese tradition or the Indian or the Persian or the Greek language traditions, you have any number of different positions, lots of people saying different sorts of things. So Mencius, as I say, identifiable very much as following along in the steps of Confucius that not all thinkers of the time were doing. So talk about Confucius just for a slide here. Confucius, just to review that, comes at the beginning of the Warring States period, 6th century, pretty early. Of course, the 5th century is the golden age of Athens. Confucius coming into that Warring States period, where his project was, of course, to be a diplomat and try and bring everybody together. Famously, he advised people they should take down their defensive walls, which pretty much nobody did. But he was very significant in where he was. He was in the right time, if you will, because then under his leadership, there was an attempt to sort of solidify Chinese culture. There was worries that it was disintegrating again, like as in all very fertile philosophical and cultural times. This was a time of great disruption, military violence, and so on. And so Confucius and others worked to sort of get the patria, get the patrimony of China, and they gathered together lots of texts and put those texts into editions. And for many, many years, hundreds and hundreds of years, the Chinese civil service was based on examinations primarily about these books, the 5 great books and so on. It's a good thing to learn about. The most important ones there for the general scholar would be the I Ching and the Tao Te Ching of Taoism. And through this activity really was how Confucius really established himself as sort of an avatar of Chinese culture. So, so the thing where we want to see Mencius following Confucius on that second bullet point there, he's a defender of Chinese national identity, but also a theorist. Confucius says, and this is the thing, Confucius says that the individual is really a product of the society, a product of mass society. And this is important to understand because when we look at diplomatic and social tensions between China and the Western world, just to use those cliches of East and West for a second here, we really want to understand where that comes from. Sort of early modern tradition of people like Hobbes and Locke, the liberal social theorists who were the influencers of the revolutions in France and the United States in the 18th century had what we call a social contract theory, like Jean-Jacques Rousseau. And this is one that really emphasizes the individual, and the state is really there to protect and empower the individual in the pursuit of happiness, as it were. And Confucius has an interesting theory that the individual is really a product of the mass society, that, if you had a very simple society, you wouldn't have a lot of differentiation between one person and another. You might have the men and the women, the adults and the children, maybe you might have a head person or something, but there wouldn't really be very much differentiation in social rules such that you would come to have a very robust sense of yourself as an individual. Confucius's theory is that you get that sense in a modern society, consider like ultra-modern society of ours, where there's a tremendous amount of different kinds of roles and identities and stratifications and all sorts of things cross-cutting to individuate ourselves from the people around us, even very close to us. So this is the thing to understand, the difference between Chinese social theory and Western European social theory is the difference between seeing that the individual really comes from the collective and the primary duty is to the collective. That's really essentially the Confucian view, and that very Western, very American view that it's all about the individual. And so then at the end of the slide, their loyalty to family, respect for tradition. Confucius, in that sense, a very conservative kind of figure. Of course, literally conservative, in as much as Confucius's project was to preserve what he saw as good coming out of the ancient Chinese tradition and helping it to form the Chinese nation, which he did. Then, in notably hundreds of years later in the Han Dynasty. All right, so to Mencius then, I say on the slide here, Mencius's emotional turn. Again, Confucius kind of cerebral, very formal, because Confucius was really putting an emphasis on formalities and rituals as a way of transmitting and preserving culture. So you really get that sense of formality from Confucius. But Mencius is really, I think, a psychological thinker, really. He's doing a kind of social psychology in his work. The genius of Mencius was to realize that social theory could not ignore social psychology. That's what we really get in Mencius. And that the Confucian emphasis on self-control needed a reevaluation of the importance of emotional life, a culture that really puts a big emphasis on the individual's ability to control themselves and sort of, adapt themselves to the needs of the collective. It's going to be one that's got built into it a lot of sort of emotional strain. And we can see that even today. But Mencius's genius was to understand that and to look at the emotional life and to place emotional life at the center of his social theory. When he talks about, he's always wants the ruler to understand that the ruler needs to take care of the well-being of the citizens, not just in a superficial way, but in an emotional way as well. Where Confucius might say that a society is stable when everyone understands why they have the place that they do and the role that they have in the society. Mencius adds to that always a sort of emotional enrichment, that a stable society is going to be one where people are happy and content on an emotional level with their station in society and with the society as a whole. Second bullet point, Mencius appreciated there could be no separation between rational motives and what we would call EQ or emotional health. Again, this is what I find most strikingly modern about him, is his attention to emotion and cognition. And the cultivation of healthy emotional responses was key to developing citizens. This is very similar to Aristotle, and not only in the Nicomachean Ethics, of course, where he gives us his famous taxonomy of the virtues, but also, for example, in Aristotle's Poetics, where he explained the functions of theater as helping us to sort of expand our emotional responses and our emotional repertoire when we watch the tragedies, getting us into situations that we don't experience in our personal life. So as I say, I would compare Mencius mostly to Aristotle on that degree, that there is a sort of natural kind of emotional responses that can be damaged in one way or another, or can be very fulfilled in a healthy person. And this is Mencius's concentration all the time. Last bullet point on this slide, Mencius challenged the universalism of Confucian ethics. The universalism here I'm meaning by, again, it's kind of formality. We're just talking about any person, any citizen, arguing that ethical response was naturally strongest among family and loved ones. Confucius, of course, very much emphasizing duty to family, loyalty to the parents, loyalty to the ancestors. But in this Confucian context of sort of the transmission of culture, Mencius sees something that we see in modern ethical theorists. We see this, for example, in some feminist ethical thinking. Mencius says, look, you're going to be naturally have the greatest regard for the people who are closest to you actually in your personal experience. And then the idea was kind of to build that out, to use, that is, our emotional experience and our emotional reality with our loved ones, the people closest to us, and to build that out and to expand that until we had a better understanding that informed our policies and informed our actions. Okay. So a nice thing about Mencius, of course, it's always nice in any philosopher, social thinker, or psychologist, is he has a very positive theory of human nature. Reminds me of a Buddhist in some ways that way. He thinks that people are basically good. He thinks that you've got in place an ordinary person, an ordinary child, the right kinds of emotional responses. The trick is to reinforce those, reward those, and instruct a person on how they can elaborate those and the importance of those emotional responses. For example, as he says a young boy or that is going to have empathy for, say, their pet animal. They're going to love the animal, say, but they might not realize that that their appreciation of the experience that the animal is having, or that their sibling is having, or whatever, is going to be something that's common to all sentient beings. And that's the thing that needs to be pointed out to them. Of course, we also teach children to have empathy for animals when they don't understand that at a very young age. From seeing the suffering of those present to us, we can learn to imagine the suffering of the more distant. So Mencius's teaching is that you take the right kinds of emotional, empathetic responses, which are already there and encourage them and develop them and sort of point them outward, which is, after all, what we do, I think, when we're giving the right kind of instruction to children. Second bullet point, above all, this kind of moral instruction is critical for the upbringing of a ruler. A lot of Chinese philosophy is always addressed to someone who's got a lot of responsibility, to a ruler. It's an effect of the role of philosophy in that culture. The kind of people who would be reading these texts or hearing these teachings tended to be very high status people, and the writers, both Confucius and Mencius, for example, are always thinking their ambition, certainly as writers and thinkers, is to influence the rulers, to influence public policy. Lack of empathy and the accompanying failure to attend to the well-being of the citizens is then, on this view, the disqualifying failure in any ruler. What's ultimately going wrong when the ruler is losing their grip or leading society in a bad direction is that there is a lack of their empathetic abilities, a lack of their empathetic realization. That certainly is Mencius's view. He gives a lot of very earthy examples. One example Mencius gives here is to say the ruler enjoys sex a lot, but then they ought to be, if that's true, then they ought to be able to realize that you don't want to wipe out too many of the men in rash warfare, intemperate warfare, and you don't want to have some extravagant harem when you've got like 600 women cloistered because they're yours. And this is the example that he really uses. If you think that sex is good, then you ought to at least be able to perform the the empathetic exercise of realizing that you've got to make sure there are enough men and enough women for everybody to go around. And of course, then, as I mentioned in the last sentence there on the slide, this also always in this kind of thinking has to do with following the flow of nature, being in touch with nature, something that's common both to Taoist thinking and also to Stoic thinking. Okay, so big takeaway about Mencius: he has a positive view of human nature, just thinks that the goodness needs to be cultivated. So about these emotional virtues, because the virtues, the S4, I'm going to have 3 on this slide and then the big one on the next. The virtues are all emotional. They all manifest themselves as emotional responses. The trick to having good character is to have the right kind of emotional responses. I think that's a basic teaching of Mencius. He recognizes the connection between emotional affect and the motivation to act. This is a basic sort of clinical psychological insight. You've got to be having some kind of emotional experiences to form motivation. All the virtues on Mencius's account manifest as emotional experiences, as feelings. The starting one that he does believe is a natural human trait that then needs to be cultivated is benevolence, empathy, the feeling of compassion. This has to be the start. And notice, I mean, there are lots of different people. I'm sure all of us, I hope so, understand the importance of empathy and benevolence and compassion. But notice, looking at that from a Confucian sort of point, because in this Confucian tradition, personal identity is really a product of social context. Without the individuals really coming out of the society, without communal identity, a human remains a mere animal, really. I mean, there's nothing less than that. The interpersonal empathy, the bedrock of civilization. I think the sort of axial age at the middle of the first millennium BCE, we see all across Asia, from the Greek world to the Chinese world, this kind of, it's a movement from the many to the one, this development of empathy and kind of universal consciousness. The second one, righteousness. Righteousness is, I mean, it means something quite different, I think, here in Mencius than we usually think of it. But we can recognize it very much when we experience Chinese society or Japanese society, Asian society in general, even just a little bit, the feeling of admiration or disdain for good behavior and bad behavior of loved ones and peers. It's not arrogance towards the stranger or the outsider. It's more like, sort of letting you have it when you're behaving in a way that's not up to snuff, and a great attention to dishonor and losing face. It's an emotional attunement to the moral condition of the other. It's a noticing and a not overlooking. Again, that's very Confucian. Compare that to a society where you sort of, people might be sketchy or dicey, but you let them have their privacy, you let them go their own way. It's very Confucian and a prominent feature of Asian culture that I'm sure everyone seeing this is familiar with. And then propriety, the feeling of respect. Respect is established through the observance of rituals. Proper mastery of ritual shows respect and commitment to the collective and to other individuals. Of course, it was also a mark of social status in ancient China that you had memorized, that you had a good handwriting, that you knew how to do the tea ceremony and so on. These were signals of both virtue and status. But the last sentence on the slide there, rituals moderate emotional responses. Performing the rituals when we meet, when we part, having ritual ways of interacting is a way for us to keep the intemperate or unevolved emotions kind of at bay and elevate the discourse to a more civilized kind of level. I think that's a really big part of ritual. It's something that I think is very well developed in Asian societies that a lot of other societies could do well to emulate, really, on that regard. So benevolence, righteousness, and propriety, and then finally wisdom, which wisdom is an interestingly emotional concept in Mencius. Wisdom is for Mencius an emotional sense of the rightness or wrongness of any action. Simple as that. It's having moral sense. It's the product of cultivating benevolence, righteousness, and propriety. You start with benevolence, which is something that's kind of built into a healthy, well-functioning person. And righteousness and propriety, if you will, are about socialization. In the end, you come to have someone who has, hopefully someone who has wisdom. Mindful of the Greek concept of praxis, which is sort of the union of theory and practice, the two things coming together, the unity of thought and action. But in Mencius, this isn't primarily driven by logic or theory, but it's the union of emotional response, logic, and action, a long cultivated pre-reflective response. Think of calligraphy or martial arts, for example, where you have a great deal of spontaneity, but spontaneity that's kind of based on and enabled by a great deal of practice and discipline. You're almost getting to something like muscle memory, right, as you say in music. So, and then wisdom is the thing that sort of elevates a person to a real agent and not just a creature of tradition or a creature of propriety. The second bullet point, Mencius' own example has these wonderful earthy examples. Ordinarily, propriety forbids a man to touch a married woman, but of course, right, if a woman is drowning, wisdom teaches benevolence overrules propriety. That might look really simple and sort of common sense, but note that Mencius is pointing out that it's our emotional awareness that underwrites as well as overrules our formal awareness. Very many great injustices might be avoided by this simple percept. It's the obtuse leader or the obtuse official, the obtuse agent who doesn't get it, who doesn't see that cross-cutting where the what's emotionally proper is really ultimately sort of the guide. But then those, assuming those emotions are the benevolent and salutary emotional responses. That's what the leader has to have. They've got to have those right emotional responses. You can't just be by the book. Mencius, by the way, just as a cosmological sort of note, you had Mosey and his followers who thought that the world was very well organized at some sort of higher level. But Mencius didn't think that. Mencius thought that the world was a very capricious sort of world, and we need to cultivate our own ability, particularly our emotional ability, to deal with adversity and to deal with all of the different myriad different situations that the world threw up at us. And that's why he thinks that this kind of wisdom is what a leader ultimately needs, and not some kind of formal discipline. So getting into that, sort of an interesting idea, maybe a little bit further, Many traditions think of rational thinking and emotional response as two poles, of course. Plato does think this. And it's a stereotype, isn't it? Right brain, left brain, and all that kind of stuff. But Mencius, what I was surprised and impressed by with Mencius is he's so sophisticated, his understanding of the role of emotional experience in motivation and how much emotional responses have to do with what we really think of as good character. He's really not someone who thinks that the most rational person is the best or most evolved person. Mencius teaches that reflection itself originates in emotional experience. He thinks that we start to think about things because we're emotional beings, which I think makes a lot of sense. I mean, you sort of the movement from conscious phenomenal experience to intelligent cognition, you know, the one being something that is motivated by the positives and negatives of the first. At a deep level, he has no distinction between reason and emotion at all. And I think that's something in Mencius that could probably be explored a lot more. Whereas, for example, a philosopher like Kant has a very rationalist ethics that you need to generalize and universalize and put yourself in the position of sort of any rational being. Ask yourself, can any rational being act this way? But Mencius points out it's precisely my own desires and aversions that enable me to empathize. I can only generalize if I'm a person having personal human experiences, and those are essentially emotional experiences. So it's emotional cultivation that is the most that is absolutely necessary. Yeah, this is also Aristotle's reaction to the rationalism of Plato. Mencius gives us the example that I ought to be, you know, think about greed. It ought to be if I realize that I want nice things, that I want to be economically comfortable, then, you know, if I'm functioning well, I'm going to get from there to the need for prosperity of the community, that everyone's comfortable. That's the idea versus the ego, you know, and so in that sense, he's, you know, classical ancient wisdom. Last point there, then, just as a matter for philosophers, in ethical theory, there's a conventional distinction between cognitivist theories like Kant, where he thinks that it's a logical exercise to universalize, non-cognitivist theories like, say, for example, Hume, who says there's a kind of moral sense that's kind of precognitive. But you can't really, you know, I mean, you see that Mencius is really interested in emotion, but you can't really characterize Mencius, pigeonhole him as a non-cognitivist in that way, that sentimental way, as they say, because he really is onto something deeper when he sees this connection between being able to think about things rationally at all and having the right kind of rational responses. So, I mean, that's one of, I think, the impressive things about Mencius. So, okay, well, that went by pretty quickly, but let me just step out of here. Stop the share. So Mencius, a Confucian to be sure. And because notice also the last thing I guess I'll say about Mencius is all of these emotions that he talks about, benevolence, empathy, starting with empathy, right? It's the paradigmatic social emotion. I mean, when he talks about emotions, he's thinking of emotions in terms of how people relate to each other, how people interact with each other. He thinks that's what emotions are for, really. He thinks that is that our subjective experience, our emotional experience, is something that's got an intersubjective function. He doesn't think that our emotional responses are just sort of matters of our own private suffering and pleasure. He thinks, first of all, that our emotional responses are drivers and necessary components of our rational thinking, of our ability to think reasonably and be reasonable at all. But he also thinks that the origin and the function of emotions is essentially social. And that's what makes him a real Confucian. That we're social beings through and through. That we're social beings before we develop individuality. Again, a proposition that he has in common with Confucius, that he gets from Confucius. But the innovation of Mencius is to bring up the importance of emotions. And I think in that sense, think of, say, in the modernist movement, someone like Freud saying, look, you've devalued the irrational and overvalued the rational. It's out of balance. It's causing problems. And that's what we're going to address. I think Mencius is nothing less than that. Mencius is actually onto that same problem, but about 2,200 years before the modernist movement at the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century in Europe. So as I say, I would say when we realize this about Mencius, he's really very, very impressive indeed. So that's just a very short introduction to Mencius. The book is called Mencius for the most part, or The Mencius. And I recommend it to you. There's just an awful lot of wonderful stuff to be found in Chinese philosophy. Mencius, certainly one of the real pleasures of that, as I hope maybe I got a little bit of that sense of that across to you today. I hope so. Thank you for listening. Thank you for joining me, and I'll see you soon. All right.